Hey guys, before we jump into the video, if you haven't watched previous part yet, I've got you covered. The link is in the description. Get ready to dive into an unforgettable tale, where every moment counts and every choice shapes the future. So, sit back, relax, and let the story begin. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot. The September nights in the Scottish Highlands were biting cold. As soon as Harry stepped off the train, a gust of chilly wind hit him square in the face, penetrating his bones. "So cold," Ron said through chattering teeth. "First year's this way?" A familiar voice called out. "Come on over." "Oh, Harry, I see you. How are you doing?" "It's Hagrid," Harry told Ron, waving high above his head. "Hagrid, I'm over here." Hagrid's towering figure was unmistakable. He waved back warmly and called out to the children. "Any more first years? Come along. I'll take you all to the school." This wasn't Harry's first time down this path. It was muddy and slippery, full of thorns. A trail said to have been walked by the founders of Hogwarts when they first established the school. It was meant to remind new students of the founders' hardships in building such a legacy. A lesson in appreciating the past, so to speak. "Just around this bend, and you'll see Hogwarts," Hagrid called out. "Ahead is the lake. We'll be taking boats across." To a boat. "Got it? You can figure out your groups now." Harry grabbed Ron's arm. As he glanced back, Hermione appeared beside them with a small, chubby boy clutching a toad in his arms. "Harry, Ron, this is Neville," Hermione introduced them. Then she turned to Neville, saying, "This is Harry. He's the one who found your toad." "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Neville said shyly, his voice trembling with gratitude. "No problem. Just call me Harry," Harry replied warmly, his smile radiant. Neville felt as if Harry were a little sun, dispelling his fear and even the cold that seemed to cling to him. "Shall we? The four of us in a boat," Ron suggested, slinging an arm around Harry's shoulders and addressing Hermione and Neville. "Sounds good," Hermione agreed, though she muttered under her breath, "I just hope we don't get expelled." "Relax, Hermione. We only used the levitation charm in drama studies. It's not like we cast." Harry trailed off, realizing that mentioning the killing curse might not be the best idea. "Cast what?" Neville asked, puzzled. "Alohomora," Harry quickly said, changing the subject. "Come on, let's keep up. We need to get on the boats." None of them seemed suspicious. After all, at their age, they couldn't possibly know what the killing curse was. The temperature on the lake was even colder than when they'd first stepped off the train, likely due to the damp air. The young witches and wizards huddled into their robes, trying to shield themselves from the biting chill. Only when their boats reached the shore did they feel even a hint of relief. Hagrid led them to the gates of the castle. "Wait here," he said. "It won't be long before." Before he could finish, the massive doors swung open, revealing a stern-looking witch dressed in emerald green robes. It was Professor McGonagall. "All the first years are here, Professor McGonagall," Hagrid said. McGonagall nodded. "I'll take them from here, Hagrid. I'll lead them into the castle." Hagrid waved at Harry before turning to leave. "First years, follow me," McGonagall instructed. The new students followed her into the castle, eventually arriving in a small chamber. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she began. "The feast is about to begin, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you must first be sorted into your respective houses. The sorting is an important ceremony because your house will be your home at Hogwarts. You'll attend classes, sleep in the dormitories, and spend your free time in the common rooms with your housemates. The four houses are Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Each house has a proud history and has produced outstanding witches and wizards. During your time at Hogwarts, your triumphs will earn your house points, while any rule-breaking will lose points. At the end of the year, the house with the most points is awarded the House Cup, a great honor. I hope each of you will bring glory to your house." In a few moments, the sorting ceremony will take place in front of the entire school. I suggest you take this time to tidy yourselves up and look presentable. Her gaze lingered briefly on Neville's cloak before sweeping over Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger, please come with me," she said. Then her eyes landed on Draco Malfoy. "And Mr. Malfoy as well." Hermione's knees buckled. "Oh no, Harry, oh no," she whimpered tearfully. "We're going to be expelled." Draco overheard Hermione's sobs and let out a derisive laugh. Harry glanced over and saw Draco silently mouthing the word, "mudblood," at Hermione. That brat really needs a lesson, Harry thought. But first, he needed to figure out how to handle this situation. "Hermione, don't worry," Ron tried to comfort her. "Even if we get expelled, you'll still have me and Harry by your side." Hermione only cried harder at that. The four were soon led into a small room. Inside, 4 individuals were seated. Harry immediately recognized one of them, Dumbledore, whom he had seen on a chocolate frog card. To Dumbledore's left was a short man in formal attire with a bow tie, sitting next to a plump which dressed simply, with a few green leaves adorning her robes. On Dumbledore's right sat a wizard with greasy black hair and a hooked nose. The hook-nosed man's eyes locked onto Harry, a flash of recognition followed by a cold, emotionless stare. Harry instinctively felt that this man didn't like him. Did I offend him somehow? Harry wondered. "The matter is quite clear." The man spoke first. "Mr. Potter cast a curse on a fellow student aboard the train, with Miss Granger and Mr. Weasley as his accomplices." Hermione let out a loud, despairing sob. "Take it easy, Severus," Dumbledore interjected, his half-moon spectacles glinting as he looked at Harry with a smile. "Why don't we hear from Harry and his friends? It wouldn't be fair to judge based on one side of the story." Snape cast Harry a long, penetrating look before silently consenting to Dumbledore's suggestion. Since no one raised objections, Dumbledore began. "It's not uncommon for disagreements to arise on the Hogwarts Express. I've heard Draco's side of the story, but I'd like to hear from you 3 about what happened." "But Malfoy was on the train the whole time. How did he—" Ron's face flushed red, utterly dumbfounded by Draco's tactic of reporting first. With a smug grin, Draco pulled out a mirror from his pocket. "A 2-way mirror. Father gave it to me before school started," he said, shaking the mirror with an air of superiority. "You see, Weasley, some wizarding families just have it better. My father makes sure I have the very best." "Mr. Malfoy?" Professor McGonagall's stern voice cut through his boast. "Please stick to the topic at hand." Draco hesitated but then raised his eyebrows in a mocking challenge directed at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Harry, however, had spent the walk to the office carefully plotting a way to turn the tables on Malfoy. He was already aware of Malfoy's familial influence. His father was a Hogwarts governor, after all. That kind of leverage could easily jeopardize the position of 3 unprotected students. Yet, McGonagall had a reputation for fairness, and Harry decided to appeal to that. He also knew she was the head of Gryffindor, the house where both his parents had once belonged. Their legacy, as student leaders, suggested they'd been her pride and joy. The other professors' roles were also fairly clear. The stout witch with leaves on her robes was likely the Hufflepuff head of house, while the greasy-haired man glaring at him had to be the Slytherin head of house. Harry wasn't expecting much sympathy from Snape, but he was determined to win over the rest. "Professor," Harry began, his voice steady. "Go ahead, Harry," Dumbledore said, his twinkling eyes offering reassurance. McGonagall also nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Harry continued, "I'm sorry, but on the train, we didn't want to engage with Malfoy. It's just that when he found out Hermione was from a Muggle family, he called her a name." McGonagall's expression darkened. "What name?" Harry hesitated, feigning reluctance. Finally, he mumbled, "Mudblood, Professor. I didn't know what it meant at first, but my aunt once told me about my mum crying at home during a holiday. Someone at school called her a stinky little. Is that true, Mr. Malfoy?" McGonagall demanded sharply. The commanding tone of a teacher confronting a misbehaving student left Draco visibly cowed. He hung his head and muttered, Yes. Harry felt some relief, but as his eyes darted to Snape, he caught the professor staring at him. Enough! Snape's voice was ice-cold. Harry braced himself for an onslaught of bias in Malfoy's favor. After all, Snape was Slytherin's head of house. It seemed only natural he would defend his student. But instead, Snape turned to Draco with a steely gaze. Mr. Malfoy, is this what you consider pure-blood decorum? Perhaps your parents, Lucius and Narcissa, should be called in to see what kind of son they've raised. Snape's words faltered briefly, but then he pressed on, his face a mask of indifference. Your house will lose 20 points after the sorting ceremony. Harry's eyes widened in astonishment. He'd assumed Snape would be adversarial, but here he was, reprimanding Draco and docking points from his own house. Cold on the outside, warm on the inside. Classic Slytherin, Harry mused. Ron was equally dumbfounded, his jaw practically on the floor. He'd heard countless tales from his brothers about Snape's favoritism toward Slytherin. Even Percy, the model student, had claimed Snape never deducted points from his house. What was going on today? McGonagall, though, looked entirely unsurprised. She fixed Draco with a severe glare. Since Professor Snape has dealt with your behavior, I won't add further punishment, she said firmly. But understand this, Mr. Malfoy. Such language is absolutely forbidden at Hogwarts. Draco stared at the floor, utterly deflated. Now, Mr. Potter, McGonagall continued, turning to Harry. Standing up for a friend is commendable, but we don't encourage the use of hexes on other students. Got it. Harry immediately understood the subtext. Don't get caught. Yes, Professor, Harry replied earnestly. He bowed respectfully to the assembled professors. We're sorry for causing trouble on the first day. Very well, Mr. Potter, McGonagall said, a faint smile breaking her stern demeanor. You may return to the Great Hall with your friends. The sorting ceremony is about to begin. Harry led the still-stunned Hermione and Ron out of the room, each of them bidding the professors goodbye as they left. What a polite child, McGonagall said, folding her hands together. He truly reminds me of Lily. Indeed, Minerva, Dumbledore agreed, nodding thoughtfully as he glanced at Snape's unreadable expression. Shall we proceed? The sorting awaits. Back in the Great Hall, Harry and his friends were instantly surrounded by curious first-years. What happened? Are you all right? Neville asked worriedly. We're fine, Ron assured, puffing out his chest. The professors didn't give us a hard time. Look, we're back for the sorting, aren't we? He sounded completely carefree, despite having been terrified about expulsion only moments earlier. You think this is over, Weasley? Draco sneered from behind them. We've got a long year ahead. Ron bristled, but Hermione grabbed his arm. Don't take the bait, Ron, she warned. He's just trying to provoke you. Right, you're right. With Hermione's advice sinking in, Ron managed to restrain himself. For now. After Hermione's persuasion, Ron reluctantly decided to stop watching Draco, opting instead to ignore his provocations. As the tension eased, Ron shifted his attention to chatting with the others about the sorting ceremony. Having worried earlier about being expelled, Ron now found his anxiety settling on the sorting itself. He wasn't alone. Before long, all the young witches and wizards, even those from pure-blood families, began to share the same unease. Surprisingly, even Draco Malfoy, usually so smug, looked pale. My father said he had to fight a werewolf when he was sorted, Draco muttered nervously. The group exchanged incredulous glances, their faces turning an odd shade of purple as they tried to process this revelation. The murmurs and whispers filled the air until, suddenly, the Great Hall fell silent. The change was almost tangible, as though an invisible hand had pressed pause on the entire room. Professor McGonagall strode to the front, carrying a four-legged stool, which she placed before the gathered first-years. Atop the stool, she set a pointed wizard's hat that was patched, frayed, and undeniably ancient. Harry recognized it immediately. It was the sorting hat, the very same one he had worn during his first year at Hogwarts. Then the hat twitched. Its brim split wide open like a mouth, and it began to sing. You may think I'm not much to see, but don't judge a book by its cover, my friend. If you can find a hat more magical than me, I'll gladly eat myself in the end. Your top hats may shine with a polished gleam, your silk hats may sit so high and proud, but I am the sorting hat of Hogwarts, and my wisdom sets me apart from the crowd. Deep within your mind, your dreams are stored, and I can see them all with ease. Place me on your head. Don't be afraid. I'll guide you to where your heart agrees. Perhaps you'll belong in brave Gryffindor, where dwell the daring and the bold. Their courage and chivalry shine so bright, their legends are timelessly told. Or maybe in kind and loyal Hufflepuff, where hard work and honesty reign. Through toil and care, they light the way, and their dedication is never in vain. In wise old Ravenclaw you may reside, with wit and wisdom to spare. They welcome those who love to learn, and seek knowledge everywhere. Or perhaps in cunning Slytherin, where ambition and resourcefulness rule. They'll help you achieve your greatest dreams, though slyness may be their most useful tool. So place me on your head, and don't you fret, I'll find where you belong. Your secrets are safe with me, dear child, for I've been sorting for centuries long. I am the magical sorting hat, a talking hat with a purpose grand. So let the sorting now begin. Welcome to Hogwarts, the finest in the land. The great hall burst into thunderous applause as the sorting hat bowed theatrically to each of the house tables before settling into stillness once again. So, we just have to wear the hat? Ron asked skeptically, wrinkling his nose. I'm definitely going to kill Fred and George. They told me I'd have to fight a troll. And the worst part is, I actually believed them. And your dad? Didn't he say you'd have to wrestle a giant spider? Harry teased, smirking. Ron froze mid-protest. Well, that's not entirely relevant. Harry chuckled, satisfied with his successful jab. At the front of the hall, Professor McGonagall stepped forward with a roll of parchment in her hand. She picked up the sorting hat, which gave a disgruntled huff. Handle me gently. I'm old enough without being yanked around like this, the hat grumbled. Laughter rippled through the hall, but McGonagall ignored the hat's complaints and began reading from her list. When I call your name, step forward, put on the hat, and sit on the stool to be sorted, she instructed. The ceremony began. Hannah Abbott, a rosy-cheeked girl with blonde braids, stumbled forward, placed the hat on her head, and sat nervously. Moments later, the hat declared, Hufflepuff. The table on the far right erupted into cheers as Hannah joined them. Harry noticed the fat friar, Hufflepuff's house ghost, waving enthusiastically in welcome. Susan Bones. Hufflepuff. Susan hurried to sit beside Hannah. Terry Boot. Ravenclaw. A round of applause greeted Terry as he joined a group of students who welcomed him warmly. Justin Finch-Fletchley. Hufflepuff. Hermione Granger. Go on, Hermione, Ron urged. Taking a deep breath, Hermione walked to the stool and placed the hat on her head. Gryffindor, the hat announced. Ron grinned in satisfaction as Hermione hurried to sit at their table. Neville Longbottom. Neville tripped over his own feet on the way to the stool, earning a few giggles from the crowd. The hat took its time, but eventually declared, Gryffindor. Neville, in his excitement, forgot to take off the hat as he ran back to his seat. Oi, boy, the hat shouted. I'm not a souvenir. The hall erupted in laughter as Neville turned scarlet, returning the hat sheepishly. When Malfoy's name was called, he strutted forward with exaggerated confidence. The hat had barely touched his head before it declared, Slytherin. Malfoy sauntered over to the Slytherin table, looking immensely pleased with himself. Finally, Professor McGonagall called, Harry Potter. The hall buzzed with whispers. Potter? Did she say Potter? Is it the Harry Potter? All eyes turned to him, watching his every move. Harry walked forward with measured calm, taking the sorting hat from McGonagall with both hands. He thanked her politely, earning a small smile in return. Placing the hat on his head, Harry suddenly heard a familiar voice in his mind. Ah, back again? Funny, I could have sworn I sorted you once before. The old Sorting Hat's words made Harry's heart tighten. Oh, was he discovered? Really? Harry feigned calmness and asked, neither confirming nor denying anything. Yes, the Sorting Hat never makes mistakes, the Hat affirmed confidently. I remember you. Last time I sorted you, I even advised you to join Slytherin, but you insisted on Gryffindor. If nothing else had happened, Harry honestly wouldn't have minded going to Slytherin. But when he was applying for a scholarship, he had spent a moment alone with Phineas Nigellus Black. Afterward, he asked Deputy Headmistress Weasley which house Headmaster Black had been in. Upon hearing the answer, Slytherin, Harry's determination had solidified. Even if I drop out, I won't go to Slytherin. So, this time, will you still advise me to join Slytherin? Harry asked in return. I wouldn't think someone daring enough to use Polyjuice Potion to impersonate the headmaster would be a Slytherin. Oh heavens, you should have seen Phineas' face. It was priceless. The Sorting Hat said with glee. You even made the Great Hall permanently display Gryffindor's banners, though Phineas quickly revoked that order. Suddenly, the Hat seemed to realize something mid-sentence. Wow, time really is a magical thing. I never thought I'd see you back at age 11. But don't worry. The Sorting Hat keeps its secrets. Really? Harry was skeptical. Absolutely. Since my creation, I've never revealed any student's secrets, the Hat vowed. Not even that troublesome one who gave Albus such headaches. Harry was willing to trust the Hat's professionalism. After all, if the Hat leaked secrets, there wouldn't have been a Voldemort. So, which house will you recommend this time? Harry asked in his mind. No one betrays their own house, do they? The Hat chuckled. Without a doubt, you belong in Gryffindor. Then what are you waiting for? Announce it. I'm ready, Harry said impatiently. The attention from all around made him a bit uncomfortable. Though the Sorting Hat communicated mentally, Harry still found it unsettling. This is heartbreaking, kiddo, the Hat complained. Old friends should catch up, but you can't wait to get rid of me. It's truly disheartening. You have a heart? Harry asked in surprise. I think I've changed my mind. You should go to Azkaban. The Hat replied with a hint of mock indignation. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Harry quickly apologized. He didn't want to be sent straight to Azkaban. Then he asked, by the way, when did this headmaster join Hogwarts? Why don't I remember him? The headmaster? The Hat thought for a moment and then replied, if I recall correctly, he entered in your 7th year. Phineas said you were missing, so it makes sense you wouldn't know him. How does it feel to see a junior become headmaster? It's a bit surreal, Harry admitted. But since I never met him as a kid, it doesn't feel too odd. Ha! You should have seen young Albus, the Hat said slyly. Oh? Which house was he in? Harry asked. Without a doubt, Gryffindor, the Sorting Hat said proudly. Harry nodded knowingly and spent a long time reminiscing with the Sorting Hat. Finally, the Hat, seemingly content, said, catching up with an old friend is delightful. As a token of appreciation, the Hat has prepared a special sorting ceremony for you. What is it? Harry asked curiously. The Hat didn't answer. Just as Harry thought it was preparing for a dramatic announcement, he felt something hard hit his head. He removed the hat and saw a hilt inside. Intrigued, he grasped the hilt and, with a clang, pulled out a magnificent silver sword. At the same time, the Sorting Hat shouted triumphantly, without a doubt, Gryffindor. The Great Hall fell silent. Then, after a moment, 3 of the 4 house tables erupted into thunderous applause, excluding Slytherin. We got Potter! We got Potter! The Weasley twins stood on their seats, waving their arms in excitement. Harry turned to the teacher's table. Hagrid clapped enthusiastically, barely containing his excitement. Dumbledore nodded at him with a smile, offering his applause. Meanwhile, the greasy-haired professor looked as though he couldn't stand him. Beside him, Professor McGonagall folded her hands, clearly pleased that Harry had been sorted into Gryffindor. Professor, what about this? Harry asked, holding the sorting hat in one hand and the Gryffindor sword in the other. I'll handle it, Mr. Potter, McGonagall said as she took the items from him and approached Dumbledore to hand him the sword. I never expected you to arrange such a sorting ritual, Albus, she whispered. Dumbledore looked momentarily confused. Ah! Then he understood what she meant and replied just as softly, No, Minerva, you'll see later. The headmaster has no authority to interfere with sorting, much less command the hat. McGonagall gave him a doubtful look but chose to believe him. As Harry walked to the Gryffindor table, the Gryffindors stood up to offer their most heartfelt congratulations. He sat next to Hermione on his left. On his right was a boy wearing glasses who looked scholarly. Percy Weasley. The boy introduced himself, extending a hand. Harry shook it, recognizing him as Ron's prefect brother. You're Ron brother, right? Harry asked politely, recalling Ron's mention of him. Exactly, Percy said proudly. Just then, McGonagall called out Ron's name. That's my youngest brother, Percy whispered to Harry. Gryffindor, the sorting hat declared. Ron slumped into the seat Harry and Hermione had saved for him. Well done, Ron, well done, Percy said in an exaggerated tone. I was so scared I'd end up in Slytherin, Ron admitted, still shaking off the nerves. Harry grinned and said, Then Slytherin would have gained an exceptional wizard. Ugh! Shut it, Harry. You sound like my mum, Ron retorted, rolling his eyes. I think Malfoy must feel as much pressure as I do, Ron said again. You know, the Malfoys have always been in Slytherin. Harry thought for a moment and couldn't help but laugh. What's so funny? Ron asked. Just think about it, Harry said, suppressing his laughter, as he spoke to Ron and Hermione. Malfoy asking his father, Dad, what if I'm not sorted into Slytherin? Then his father would definitely pull out his wand, point it at him and say, Draco Malfoy, you better be. Hearing Harry's imagined scenario, the two burst into laughter. At that moment, the sorting ceremony came to an end. Albus Dumbledore stood up, his face beaming as he looked at the students. He spread his arms wide as though nothing delighted him more than seeing them all gathered together. Welcome, he said. Welcome to another year at Hogwarts. Before the feast begins, I'd like to say a few words, and they are nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. The hall burst into applause and cheers. Even Harry clapped along. Thank you all. Dumbledore sat back down. If it had been Headmaster Phineas Black, he would have spoken for an hour before letting them eat. Though this slightly eccentric new headmaster was amusing, Harry couldn't help but feel that Dumbledore was more like a quirky schoolmate than a principal. An 11-year-old upperclassman and a 100-plus-year-old junior. That was certainly a rare combination. As Dumbledore sat down, the 4 long tables immediately filled with towering piles of delicious food. Roast beef, roast chicken, pork chops, lamb chops, sausages, steak, boiled potatoes, roasted potatoes, chips, Yorkshire pudding, sprouts, carrots, gravy, ketchup, and even mint humbugs. Harry used his fork to stab a piece of steak and placed it on his plate. It was well done, signifying top-quality beef. He remembered hearing that the Muggle Queen also preferred her steak well done. This looks amazing, said a ghost wearing a ruffled collar as he sadly watched Harry cut into the steak. Harry looked up at the ghost and nodded in greeting. Hello. He almost addressed him as Sir Nicholas but held back. You look familiar, said Sir Nicholas, staring at Harry with a dazed expression. I feel like I've seen you somewhere before. Just as Harry thought Sir Nicholas was about to recognize him, the ghost suddenly clapped his hands. I've got it. James Potter. You must be his son. You look almost exactly like him. You knew my father? Harry asked with interest. Of course, young Mr. Potter. James was one of Gryffindor's finest students. Sir Nicholas replied with a smile. Oh, I remember now. You're nearly headless Nick. Ron suddenly shouted, pointing at the ghost. I'd prefer it if you called me Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, the ghost said uneasily. But Seamus Finnegan, who had light brown hair, interjected, Nearly headless? How can you be nearly headless? Sir Nicholas seemed upset. He clearly didn't want to talk about this. Like this, he said irritably, grabbing his left ear and pulling downward. His head wobbled, sliding off his neck and onto his shoulder as if it were hinged. It seemed that whoever tried to behead him hadn't done a thorough job. Watching everyone's stunned expressions, nearly headless Nick looked quite pleased. He gently popped his head back onto his neck, cleared his throat and said, "Well, Gryffindor's new students, I hope you'll help us win the House Cup this year, won't you? Gryffindor hasn't won in so long. Slytherin's had a 6-year winning streak. The Bloody Baron has been insufferable. He's Slytherin's house ghost." Harry wasn't paying attention to the Bloody Baron. Instead, he turned to look at the staff table. At that moment, his scar suddenly throbbed with intense pain. This was the first time his scar had hurt since seeing Sebastian cast the killing curse at his uncle Solomon Sallow. That incident had infuriated Valacia, who restrained Sebastian with a spell and used transfiguration to save Solomon. Harry hadn't forgotten the effort it took to cast Obliviate on Solomon afterward. Solomon's obnoxiousness reminded Harry too much of Headmaster Black. He couldn't let his friend end up in Azkaban. After a while, the pain in his scar subsided. He pressed his hand to his forehead, making sure no one noticed anything unusual. However, Ron caught on. With a chicken leg in each hand, he turned to Harry and asked, "Mate, what's wrong? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine," Harry said with a smile. Then he asked Percy, "Percy, who's that teacher?" Percy assumed he meant Snape, so he smiled and answered, "That's Professor Snape. He teaches potions, but he'd much rather teach defense against the dark arts. Everyone knows he's got a knack for it." Harry wasn't asking about Snape. He'd already locked eyes with Snape in the hut earlier, and his scar hadn't hurt. "No, not Professor Snape," Harry clarified. "I mean the one next to him, wearing a turban and talking to someone." "Oh, that's Professor Quirrell," Percy replied. "He teaches defense against the dark arts. He used to teach Muggle studies, but for some reason he switched subjects. Snape was furious about it. He's been taking it out on Gryffindor ever since." "Why would Snape being upset lead to Gryffindor losing points?" Harry asked, unable to connect the dots. "Because Snape doesn't like Gryffindor. That's no secret," Percy said with a shrug. "Maybe it's because he's the head of Slytherin? You know, Slytherin and Gryffindor have always been at odds." Harry didn't argue. He wasn't sure about the current dynamics, but a century ago, with Headmaster Black in charge, relations between Gryffindor and Slytherin had been quite cordial. Harry glanced at Snape again and found that Snape was also staring at him. His gaze seemed complex. Harry wondered, could he have been close to my parents? With that thought, Harry gave Snape a polite smile, but Snape merely huffed, his face expressionless, and looked away. Harry didn't really care about Snape's reaction. After all, in his understanding, all Slytherins were full of contradictions. Take Omini's, for example, a textbook case of cold on the outside but warm on the inside. In contrast, Sebastian was warm on the outside but cold on the inside. And as the old Serpent King of Slytherin, Snape was naturally the most contradictory of them all. Makes sense, right? Food. He lowered his head and looked at the delicious meal in front of him again. It had been noon when he snacked on the train, and he was already quite hungry by now. After finishing the steak on his plate, the food on the dining table in front of him transformed into an array of sweet desserts. The British couldn't live without afternoon tea and post-meal desserts, just like the 3D zone couldn't live without Tifa. If forced to choose between the two, afternoon tea would undoubtedly be more important. Disappeared. Eventually, even the desserts on the table vanished. Professor Dumbledore stood up again, and the dining hall fell silent. "Oh, now that everyone is full and satisfied, I have a few announcements to make as we begin the new term," he said. "First-year students, please note that the Forbidden Forest is strictly off-limits to students, and some of our older students would do well to remember that as well." Dumbledore's twinkling eyes, visible through his half-moon spectacles, swept toward the Weasley twins. The message was clear. By older students, he specifically meant those two troublemakers. The Gryffindors joined the headmaster in focusing their gaze on the Weasley twins. After all, most of the points lost by Gryffindor were thanks to those two. Additionally, Mr. Filch, our caretaker, has asked me to remind everyone not to cast spells in the corridors between classes. Filch, holding his red-eyed cat, stood not far away and gave a loud snort at Dumbledore's words. Furthermore, Quidditch tryouts will be held during the second week of term. Those interested in joining their house teams should contact Madame Hooch, the flying instructor. Lastly, I must warn you that anyone who does not wish to meet a gruesome and painful death should avoid the corridor on the right-hand side of the 4th floor. Harry couldn't help but chuckle at that. He couldn't hold it in. To be honest, there wasn't a place in Hogwarts he hadn't been to. Even the Slytherin common room was a spot he'd once visited with Veritia, though the process wasn't exactly enjoyable. Percy. He's not serious, is he? Harry whispered. Impossible, Percy frowned and muttered. What's odd is that whenever he prohibits us from going somewhere, he usually explains why. For example, everyone knows the Forbidden Forest is full of dangerous creatures. I think he should at least tell us prefects more clearly. Obviously, Headmaster Dumbledore has his little secrets, Harry said softly to Percy. The kind he doesn't want anyone else to know. Fair point, Percy nodded knowingly. Now, before we all retire for the night, let us sing the school song together, Dumbledore said loudly. Harry noticed that the other teachers' smiles seemed to freeze on their faces. Dumbledore gave his wand a little flick, and a long golden ribbon flew out, twisting like a serpent above the high table as it formed lines of text. Everyone pick their favorite tune, Dumbledore said. Ready, sing. And so the entire student body and staff broke into song. Hogwarts, Hogwarts. Since the song had no set tune, everyone sang in whatever style they liked, completely ignoring whether they were in sync. The Great Hall became an even greater mess than Knockturn Alley, and Harry instantly understood why the professors wore such expressions. He remembered what the Sorting Hat had said, that Dumbledore joined the school the year after Phineas Nigellus Black's tenure as headmaster. This meant he too had suffered under Phineas. Perhaps this chaotic singing tradition was Dumbledore's revenge for enduring Phineas's annual choir rehearsals. Harry thought, though he swore he'd rather endure rehearsals with a single tune under Phineas than suffer this. In the end, only the Weasley twins were still singing along, following the somber melody of the funeral march. Dumbledore conducted their final verses with his wand, clapping the loudest when they finished. Ah, music, he said, pointing to his eyes. A magic beyond all we do here, and now it's time for bed. Off you go. The prefects stepped forward, leading the new students of each house. Hufflepuff's Gabriel Truman, Ravenclaw's Penelope Clearwater, Slytherin's Gemma Farley, and Gryffindor's Percy Weasley guided their charges toward their respective common rooms. As the Slytherin and Gryffindor groups passed each other, Harry noticed Malfoy looking particularly dejected. It must have been because of the 20 points preemptively docked from him. Even in Slytherin, the Malfoy name didn't grant absolute immunity, not even if his surname were Gaunt. Gemma Farley, a stunning Slytherin prefect, looked particularly displeased. She seemed annoyed about Malfoy losing points from their head of house. For Snape, usually biased in favor of his house, to deduct points, Malfoy must have done something seriously wrong. Harry, did you see that? Ron nudged Harry. Look at Malfoy's face. It's like he just ate something foul. He deserved it, Harry said gleefully. They hadn't walked much further when the group suddenly came to a halt. Floating in midair ahead of them was a bundle of sticks. Percy was just one step away from bumping into it. Those behind him stopped in time, afraid of colliding, creating a domino effect. It's Peeves, Percy whispered to the first years. A mischievous ghost. Raising his voice, he added, Peeves, show yourself. The response was a loud, shrill, balloon-like squeal. Do I need to fetch the Bloody Baron? Percy threatened. With a loud pop, a mischievous, clownish ghost appeared, dressed in brightly colored clothes and wearing a tall hat. One look at him, and it was clear he wasn't someone to mess with. Contrary to Percy's expectations, Peeves didn't immediately cause trouble. Instead, he seemed to notice something interesting among the new students. Peeves. They're just first years. If you play pranks on them, I'll fetch the Bloody Baron right now. Percy's threat had no effect. Peeves zipped up and down and eventually hovered over Harry's head. The great Peeves seems to have spotted an old friend. Peeves wasn't a good spirit. Harry had known that for quite some time. This ghost delighted in mischief, especially in going against others. Familiar face? You have no acquaintances here, Percy retorted angrily. They're just first years. Really? Peeves floated leisurely over to Harry, his eyes glinting with mischief. Potter, not going to greet an old friend? Peeves, Percy barked in warning. Harry is just a first-year student. Don't bother him. A first year. Peeves cackled as if Percy had told the funniest joke. Holding his stomach, he doubled over in midair with laughter. Oh, I could never forget that face, Potter. You must have known my father, James, Harry said casually, pulling out his wand. You don't think spells will work on Peeves, do you? Percy asked in surprise. Honestly, people have been trying to find a spell to deal with Peeves for years, but as you can see, so far no success. To Percy's astonishment, Peeves screamed and bolted the moment Harry pointed his wand at him. Maybe it does work, Harry shrugged. Percy opened his mouth, suddenly finding the atmosphere a bit awkward. Maybe he had other things to do, Percy offered weakly. Anyway, if you encounter Peeves again, don't provoke him. Honestly, you should be on your guard around him. He led the group forward. Don't try Harry's method. I recommend invoking the Bloody Baron's name to scare him off. The Bloody Baron is the only one who can keep him in line. Peeves doesn't even listen to us prefects. Oh, here we are. At the end of the corridor hung a portrait of a plump woman dressed in pink. Password? She asked in a smooth voice. Dragon dung, Percy replied. The portrait swung forward to reveal a circular hole in the wall. One by one, they crawled through. Neville struggled a bit, requiring some help to squeeze through. On the other side of the hole, they found themselves in the Gryffindor common room. It was a cozy circular room filled with plush armchairs. Gold and red decor adorned the walls, showcasing Gryffindor's signature colors. Percy began assigning rooms. Those whose names I call will be sharing a room. Ron Weasley, Harry Potter, Neville Longbottom, and Seamus Finnegan. The four of them exchanged glances but didn't raise any objections. After dividing the boys' and girls' dormitories, Percy added a stern reminder. School rules strictly forbid boys from entering the girls' dormitory. What about girls in the boys' dormitory? Seamus called out. No rule about that? Unfortunately, no, Percy admitted reluctantly. Fred and George chimed in from the back. Isn't it obvious? It's at your own risk. Percy responded by smacking them with a book, sending the twins laughing and scampering away from the common room. Let's head upstairs, Neville suggested, still clutching his toad. Aren't you afraid you'll overheat it? Seamus teased. You've been holding that thing all day. I'm more afraid of losing him, Neville admitted. I searched for him all over the train earlier. Oh, in their dormitory, Neville safely tucked his toad away, while Seamus began sharing his story. I'm half and half, Seamus said, swinging one leg over the bed. Dad's a muggle, and Mum only told him she was a witch after they got married. Scared the life out of him. The others laughed. Harry rubbed his eyes. Muggles not believing in magic isn't surprising. My uncle, for example, is completely against it. Even if I performed magic in front of him, he'd refuse to accept it. He's lying to himself, Seamus remarked, crossing his arms. What about you, Neville? I was raised by my gran, Neville said, looking a bit downcast. She's a witch and my parents were both wizards, but they're sick. They've been in St. Mungo's as long as I can remember. My family thought I was a squib for years, Neville added. My great-uncle Algy was always trying to force me to show signs of magic. Once, he even pushed me off the Black Lake dock, nearly drowned me, and nothing happened. Then, when I was 8, he dangled me out a window by my ankle. He let go to grab some cake my aunt offered, and I bounced. Flew across the garden and landed on the road. Everyone was overjoyed. Aunt Enid even cried from happiness. When my Hogwarts letter arrived, you should have seen their faces. They thought I didn't have enough magic to get in. Uncle Algy was so pleased he bought me this toad. Neville spilled his tales like beans from a jar, and after hearing them, Harry began to suspect that maybe the wizarding world hadn't come to rescue him sooner because of stories like Neville's. Look at Neville. His own great-uncle had tossed him into a lake and dropped him from a window. What illness do your parents have? Seamus asked gently. They were tortured with the Cruciatus curse, Neville said quietly. They never woke up. Sorry, Neville, Seamus said, clearly not expecting to stumble upon such a sad truth. The Cruciatus curse. Harry had learned it before, even used it with Sebastian. On Omini's too. The memory of using such a curse wasn't pleasant. It tortured not just the victim but the caster's soul as well. Ah, I just remembered, Ron suddenly exclaimed, then stopped himself, realizing naming Neville's parents would only cause more pain. He quickly changed the topic, saying to Harry, Harry, I think you've got some snacks in your bag. Oh, right, Harry said, glad for the distraction. He pulled his suitcase out from under his bed. I brought some Muggle snacks. Want to try them? He needed the diversion just as much as Ron did. Memories of the Cruciatus curse weren't ones he enjoyed revisiting. Muggle snacks. Ron perked up immediately. When it came to eating, Ronald had never lost in his life. Only Crabbe and Goyle from Slytherin could surpass him in this regard. Try this. Harry pulled out a red soda can and handed it to Ron. Wow, it's Coke! Seamus exclaimed in surprise. It's Coca-Cola, not Pepsi. You like Pepsi? Harry raised an eyebrow. Oh no. How could I like that dishwater? Seamus said with a disgusted expression. Harry extended his hand solemnly. Seamus, seeing this, also extended his hand and shook Harry's. In that case, we're good friends now. Friends. Seamus nodded emphatically in agreement. The rivalry between Pepsi and Coke was no less intense than the battle between sweet and salty flavors. Is this a drink? Ron curiously examined the can in his hand, pulled the tab, and poured the Coke into a cup. He stared at the fizzing bubbles, hesitating. Yikes, this color. Is it really drinkable? I mean, I've never had anything better than butterbeer. Just try it, Seamus urged. Ron picked up the cup, and the potion-like dark color made him hesitate. The bubbling liquid didn't help either. I have to ask, is this stuff really not some kind of potion? Take a sip, Harry said. With his friend's encouragement, Ron put on a brave face. He closed his eyes and took a big gulp. Wow, he exclaimed. So how is it? Pretty good, right? Harry raised an eyebrow. How does it compare to butterbeer? Butterbeer. Ron took another big gulp of Coke. What's that? Doesn't ring a bell. Hearing this, everyone burst into laughter. Harry then brought out a pile of snacks to share with his new friends. It was their first time meeting, and for most of them, their first day at Hogwarts, except Harry. No one felt like sleeping. They chatted until late into the night before bidding each other good night and falling asleep. The next morning, when Harry stepped out of the dormitory, he noticed a trail of whispers following him. That's the one with glasses. Did you see his scar? People murmured. Students from other houses even queued up outside the Gryffindor common room, treating him like a rare exhibit at a zoo. Wherever he went, they followed, whispering behind him with zero regard for boundaries. Harry didn't mind. He figured they'd stop once they got used to his presence. For the new students, the staircases of Hogwarts were their biggest headache. There were a total of 142 staircases. Some were wide and grand, others narrow and wobbly. Some changed destinations every Friday. Others had steps that vanished halfway up, requiring one to remember where to jump. There were also countless doors, some that wouldn't open unless asked politely, others that required you to press a specific spot. Some weren't doors at all but solid walls pretending to be doors. Remembering the layout was nearly impossible, as everything seemed to keep moving. Even the portraits moved around, visiting each other and having lively conversations. Harry, however, was unfazed. After all, he'd been here for 6 years. Returning to Hogwarts felt like coming home. A century ago, he had no home, just like now. If there was a place that gave him a sense of belonging, it was Hogwarts. Ron, on the other hand, marveled at his friend's sense of direction. After Harry mentioned he had an excellent sense of direction, Ron accepted it without question. But the moving staircases weren't the hardest part for new students. The ghosts were. Often, just as a student was about to open a door, a ghost would pop out, giving them a fright. Nearly Headless Nick was always happy to guide Gryffindor first years, but encountering Peeves the poltergeist was far worse than a locked door or a tricky staircase. Peeves would drop wastebaskets on your head, yank carpets out from under your feet, throw chalk at you, or sneak up behind you to grab your nose and scream, "Got your nose!" Some first years were so tormented by Peeves that they burst into tears, worried they'd be late for class. Strangely, Peeves never bothered Harry and didn't even appear in his vicinity. Ron stuck close to Harry, so much so that he forgot about Peeves entirely. Since first years were still adapting to the school, their schedules were light, leaving them plenty of time to explore Hogwarts. When Harry received the timetable, he couldn't help but think how times had changed. In Phineas Nigellus Black's era as headmaster, students wouldn't have any free time. "All of you, go learn proper manners, you uncivilized trolls." When Harry and Ron arrived at the Transfiguration classroom, only a few students were seated. It seemed no one had woken up early. Harry thought they might have stayed up late just like he and Ron had. On the podium at the front of the room sat a silver-gray tabby cat. When Harry and Ron entered, the cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed into slits. "Wow! It looks like Professor McGonagall brought her cat to class?" Ron grinned and walked forward, seemingly intending to pet the cat. "I bet she plans to use it as a teaching aid." Harry quickly grabbed Ron's arm, sensing something wasn't right. The markings around the cat's eyes resembled a pair of square glasses. He knew those glasses well. The stern Gryffindor head of house wore them. Could this cat— No, wait. Was Professor McGonagall an animagus? The more Harry thought about it, the more likely it seemed. He whispered to Ron, "Sit down, Ron. Even if it's a teaching aid, I doubt Professor McGonagall would want anyone touching her cat." "You're right." Ron quickly followed Harry to a seat. He recalled Professor McGonagall's stern expression and imagined her angry. Hiss! He took a sharp breath, his imagination of an angry McGonagall thoroughly scaring him. Harry was quite familiar with animagi, especially since there were several among the Ashwinder faction. They often transformed into wolves or big cats, such as tigers and leopards, forms that were both aggressive and agile. The downside of becoming a beast, however, was that it allowed Harry to cast ancient magic on them without any psychological burden. His favorite spell involved shrinking the animal down and then stomping on it with a swift and final stomp. While it wasn't the most sanitary approach, it was undoubtedly stress-relieving. For reasons Harry couldn't fathom, the Ashwinder followers would always scream in terror upon witnessing this magic. Was it because they didn't like it? Before long, the classroom began to fill up with students arriving one after another. Perhaps due to observing that no one dared approach the cat, the new students only observed curiously from afar, not one of them brave enough to step closer. Once everyone was seated, the cat leaped forward. In a flash, it transformed into Professor McGonagall, who now stood before them in her emerald green robes. "That was amazing!" Ron instinctively exclaimed. "Thank you for your compliment, Mr. Weasley," Professor McGonagall responded. This extraordinary introduction immediately captured the young wizard's interest. They all straightened up in their seats, eagerly anticipating the start of their Transfiguration lesson. Transfiguration is one of the most complex and dangerous branches of magic you'll learn at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall began. "Anyone caught misbehaving in my class will be asked to leave and will never return. I'm warning you now." "I'll bet, Harry," Ron whispered. She was thinking of Fred and George when she said that. Professor McGonagall shot a stern glance at Ron before proceeding to transform her desk into a pig and then swiftly back again. The students were enthralled, wishing they could start practicing such magic right away. However, they quickly realized that turning furniture into animals was a skill that would take a long time to master. For now, they had to settle for taking down a mountain of intricate notes before being handed a matchstick and instructed to transform it into a needle. For Harry, this task was a breeze. With a flick of his wand, he transformed the matchstick into a needle adorned with elegant patterns. "Wow, that's amazing!" Ron exclaimed instinctively. "Mr. Weasley?" Professor McGonagall's stern voice interrupted. "No talking during class." "But, Professor," Ron argued. "Harry just turned his matchstick into a needle in one go." Hearing this, Professor McGonagall approached and examined Harry's work. Sure enough, it was a perfectly transformed needle. "Excellent transfiguration," she praised. 5 points to Gryffindor for Mr. Potter. The class erupted into applause, partly because of Harry's skill and partly because Gryffindor had earned points. A rare occurrence, as even the first years understood how easy it was to lose points and how difficult it was to earn them back. Harry, however, remained composed, gracefully thanking Professor McGonagall. "If I couldn't manage this after 6 years, I might as well quit," he mused. McGonagall allowed herself a rare smile as she looked at Harry's green eyes, which reminded her so much of his mother. By the end of the lesson, only Hermione had managed to produce any noticeable changes in her matchstick. While her transformation was commendable, it earned Gryffindor just 2 points. A significant achievement but still overshadowed by Harry's performance. As the class ended, Hermione hurried over, inserting herself between Harry and Ron. "Harry, how on earth did you do that?" she asked, her rapid-fire speech making her excitement clear. "The professor just explained. And you immediately turned your matchstick into a needle." "Well, Harry is the chosen one," Seamus said from behind them. "You didn't really think the chosen one would be ordinary, did you?" Oddly enough, Seamus's logic was enough to convince Hermione. After all, if Harry weren't special, how could so many books have been written about him? The group made their way to the Great Hall and sat down at the Gryffindor table. "Harry," Neville asked hesitantly, "how did you do it? Can you teach me?" "It's not too difficult," Harry replied, draining his goblet of juice and drawing his wand. "Take this cup as an example. If I wanted to turn it into a bowl, I'd start by picturing the bowl clearly in my mind. Then, as Harry spoke, the goblet transformed into a beautiful blue and white porcelain bowl. "Wow!" Neville gasped, eagerly pulling out his wand. He aimed at his cup, and with a flash of light from the wand tip, it managed to swell slightly in the middle. "That's a great start, Neville," Harry praised. "Getting the object to begin transforming is a solid foundation. Just remember, the stronger your intent, the better the result." "Oh, nice work, Ron." To Harry's left, Ron had successfully turned his cup into a stemmed bowl. Considering he was working with a wand that didn't suit him perfectly, it was an impressive feat. Harry thought to himself that a new wand would make an excellent Christmas gift for his best friend. Ron beamed at the compliment but also looked a bit frustrated. "I was trying to make a regular bowl, but this is the best I can manage." "Believe in yourself," Harry encouraged. "Faith in your abilities is the best magic of all." Bolstered by Harry's words, Ron picked up his wand again and cast the spell. This time, the result was much closer to the bowl he had envisioned. "Nicely done, Ron," Seamus cheered. "Now watch this." Harry had a sinking feeling as Seamus raised his wand. Sure enough, with a loud bang, Seamus's cup exploded spectacularly, soaring into the air before landing in pieces in front of them. "Well, in a way it did change," Hermione said, picking up a fragment of the cup. "At least the opening is wider now." The afternoon brought herbology, taught by the stout Professor Sprout, who led them to the greenhouses behind the castle. There, they began learning about various magical plants and fungi and their uses. For Harry, herbology had always been one of his best subjects. Back in the 19th century, Hogwarts' herbology professor had been none other than the school's most beautiful instructor, Professor Garlick, who wore her hair in 2 braids. Harry couldn't deny that an attractive teacher could greatly enhance a student's enthusiasm for learning. He had fond memories of the kind and graceful Professor Garlick, who always had a sisterly warmth about her. He often found excuses to ask her questions after class, and she was never annoyed. On the contrary, she had even taught him how to cultivate Chinese chomping cabbage. Cassandra had often teased him about it. "Look at him," she'd say, "like a dog chasing a flying broomstick. It'll never catch it, and even if it does, it can't ride it." Since it was the first lesson for the new students, Professor Sprout didn't have them engage in any practical work. Instead, she began with theoretical knowledge. Professor Sprout was kind and patient. Perhaps all herbology professors at Hogwarts shared this trait. When Neville couldn't answer a question, she gently encouraged him, helping him recall the material with soft words. Seamus, however, was sneakily practicing transfiguration during class. He managed to succeed once, but then accidentally caused a potted bubotuber to explode with his next spell. Fortunately, Harry reacted quickly, turning Seamus's scarf into an umbrella to shield them from the splattering pus. "Well done on that transfiguration spell. 5 points to Gryffindor," Professor Sprout exclaimed. She then sternly scolded Seamus. When Seamus looked downcast, Professor Sprout somehow produced a small cake and handed it to him. Seamus solemnly promised her that he would never cause trouble in herbology class again. Professor Sprout forgave him, but as a punishment, deducted 1 point from Gryffindor. After class, Harry didn't hurry to leave. Instead, he stayed back in the greenhouse. "Mr. Potter?" Professor Sprout noticed him lingering. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Well, Professor," Harry began, choosing his words carefully, "I read about Chinese chomping cabbage in a book, and I'm quite interested in it. I was wondering if you might have a mature specimen here." "Chinese chomping cabbage is a highly dangerous plant," Professor Sprout said gently. She didn't outright refuse Harry but added, "I don't think a young wizard like you should cultivate such a perilous plant. However, seeing it in person might change your mind. Follow me." Ron and Neville exchanged glances and decided to tag along. Hermione joined them as well. Seamus, holding his cake, decided to head back. He felt a little embarrassed facing Professor Sprout again after having blown up a bubotuber. The 4 students followed Professor Sprout to the second floor of the greenhouse. They passed through some trees and stopped at a workbench. On the bench were 6 chomping cabbages with wide mouths and writhing bodies. "Here they are," Professor Sprout introduced. "The chomping cabbages in 1,000 magical herbs and fungi don't do them justice. They're far more intimidating in reality." She picked up a stick and placed it near one of the cabbages. The cabbage twisted its plump body and snapped onto the stick with a crunch, biting it cleanly in half. "Such a violent temperament," Hermione said, frowning. "Harry, I really don't think this is something we should try to grow." Before she could finish, Harry extended his wand and tapped the cabbage on its back. Then he reached out and touched it with his hand. "Harry!" Hermione and Ron shouted together. "Take your hand back now." But to their surprise, the cabbage rubbed against Harry's hand like a puppy. "I think it's actually quite friendly," Harry said, raising an eyebrow. "Want to try?" Ron looked tempted and reached out cautiously, but the cabbage turned toward him and gave a menacing grin. "On second thought, I'll pass," Ron said, quickly withdrawing his hand. Harry patted the cabbage's body, thinking of spicy exploding cabbage, dish he had tasted before. "Fascinating," Professor Sprout said, as if she had discovered a new continent. "It's amazing that a young wizard like you understands plants so well. If this were during class, I'd definitely award Gryffindor 5 points. Finally," she added, "if you like it so much, I can give you a smaller one that's less dangerous. But promise me you won't throw it at your classmates. Understand?" "Thank you, Professor. I promise I won't," Harry replied obediently. Looking into Harry's green eyes, Professor Sprout smiled softly. "This child, he's so much like Lily." Harry left the greenhouse, satisfied, with a small chomping cabbage in hand. Hermione watched him with concern, while Ron muttered, "I hope it doesn't bite Scabbers." He decided that both he and his pet would keep their distance from the cabbage. Neville, on the other hand, took a keen interest in the plant. He frequently fertilized and watered it, asking Harry about herbology whenever he had questions. Harry patiently answered every one of them, feeling no need to withhold information from his roommate. When it came to Hogwarts classes, none felt more familiar to Harry than Professor Binns's history of magic. Professor Binns was a ghost. The story went that he had fallen asleep by the staff room fireplace one evening and then, the next morning, went to class, leaving his body behind. In class, Professor Binns spoke in a monotone, droning endlessly. Harry couldn't help but feel drowsy. It was so familiar, so nostalgic. Harry's eyes grew misty. Charms class, taught by the diminutive Professor Flitwick, was another highlight. He had to stand on a stack of books to see over the podium. During the first lesson, when he called Harry's name, he was so excited that he toppled backward out of sight. In the first lesson, they learned the Lumos charm. Most students managed to cast it successfully, but Harry's wand lit up like a searchlight, earning Gryffindor another 5 points from a delighted Professor Flitwick. The real disappointment for Harry was defense against the dark arts. In fact, the entire class found it disheartening. Professor Quirrell stammered his way through lessons, telling awkward stories of his supposed adventures. To make matters worse, the classroom reeked of garlic. According to Quirrell, the garlic was to ward off vampires. But the students suggested silver might work better. To divert the conversation, Quirrell taught them a small jinx leglocker curse. The spell captured the students' attention, sparing Quirrell further questions about the garlic smell. Everyone was eager to learn the curse.
Thanks waiting for next episode.